Number 1. The Kanaljorden skulls on stakes. Picture a shallow lake in central Sweden roughly 8,000 years ago. The water is dark and still, edged with reeds, and just beneath the surface there is a platform. It is not natural. Someone has built it, laying tightly packed stones across an area about 14 by 14 meters, deliberately set at the waterline so that it sits half drowned. And rising from that platform are wooden stakes. On the tops of 2 of them are human skulls, the wood driven up through the base and into the brain case. This is the site of Kanaljorden in Motala, in the province of Östergötland, and it is one of the strangest burial places ever found in northern Europe. The site was excavated between 2009 and 2014, ahead of railway construction over the Motala River, by a team led by the archaeologist Fredrik Hallgren. Their findings were published in the journal Antiquity in 2018. What they recovered was extraordinary. At least 10 adult human skulls, fragments of an 11th, and the bones of an infant, all associated with that submerged stone structure. But almost none of the rest of the skeletons were there. The heads had been separated from the bodies and deposited here alone. One skull still had a wooden stake preserved inside it, running from the base all the way to the crown. Another retained an actual lump of preserved brain tissue kept intact for 8 millennia by the oxygen-starved mud at the bottom of the lake. Now, this is where it gets complicated. Many of the skulls showed injuries. Blunt force trauma, some of it healed long before death, some of it not. And the pattern differed between the sexes. The men tended to be struck on the top and front of the head, the women on the back. Because most of these injuries had healed, the researchers argue that this was not a massacre. The violence happened during these people's lives, sometimes years before they died. Alongside the human remains were the bones of brown bear, wild boar, red deer, roe deer, and badger, possibly offerings, possibly the remains of feasting. So what was this place? The mainstream interpretation is a secondary mortuary ritual. The dead were processed elsewhere, and their heads were carried to the water and mounted, perhaps as ancestor veneration. A more forensic reading focuses on that sex-patterned violence, suggesting structured conflict within the community, and a more speculative view imagines enemy trophies, though the presence of women and children makes a simple war trophy story hard to sustain. What nobody disputes is that the people of Kanaljorden did something deliberate, and something we still cannot fully read. And if mounting heads on stakes seems like the outer edge of what the living will do to the dead, our next site shows they could go further still and rebuild the dead from scratch. Number 2. The Cladh Hallan composite mummies. On the island of South Uist, in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, there is a Bronze Age settlement called Cladh Hallan. It is a terraced row of roundhouses, and beneath the floors of those houses, archaeologists found 4 bodies, buried in tightly flexed positions with their knees drawn up to their chests. They date to around 1500 to 1300 BCE, and 2 of them are not what they appear to be. The excavation, begun in 1988 under the direction of Mike Parker Pearson, revealed that 2 of these skeletons had been deliberately mummified. This was the first hard evidence of intentional mummification anywhere in Bronze Age Britain. Under the microscope, the outer layers of the bone showed a distinctive pattern of demineralization, the chemical fingerprint of immersion in an acidic peat bog. The bodies had been placed in a bog just long enough to halt decay, a matter of weeks or months, and then removed before the acid could dissolve the bone entirely. Soft tissue was preserved over the skeleton, and the corpse was kept. But the truly unsettling discovery came from the dating and the DNA. The skeleton that looked like a single man was actually assembled from at least 3 different people. The jaw came from one individual, the skull and neck from another, and the torso and limbs from a third. And these people had not died at the same time. The component bones differed in age by several hundred years. This was a body stitched together from ancestors who had died generations apart. The second mummified skeleton, the apparent woman, was just as strange, combining a male skull, a female torso, and an arm from yet another person, with teeth that did not match the jaw they sat in. These composite bodies were kept above ground for something like 300 to 600 years before they were finally buried under the house floors. Later genetic and isotopic work, including studies led by Terry Brown, confirmed the mixing of individuals within single bodies. So what does it mean? The leading interpretation is that these mummies fused ancestral lineages, physically merging multiple ancestors into one body to legitimize a family's claim to the land and the house they were buried beneath. Others suggest the recombination hid the identities of the dead, or repaired a decaying, venerated ancestor by swapping in fresh parts to keep a single figure intact across centuries. In 2016, Parker Pearson and colleagues argued in Antiquity that mummification was probably widespread across Bronze Age Britain, invisible to us only because soft tissue so rarely survives. For scale, these islanders were curating and rebuilding their dead at roughly the same time the pharaoh Tutankhamun was laid in his tomb, around 1323 BCE. And where Cladh Hallan shows reverence, our next grave shows how closely reverence and violence could sit together. Number 3, the Ladies of Téviec. Off the coast of Brittany, in northwestern France, lies a small island called Téviec. In 1928, the husband and wife archaeologists Marthe and Saint-Just Picard excavated a Mesolithic cemetery there, belonging to the Shell Midden hunter-gatherers who lived along this coast around 6,700 to 6,100 years ago. And in one grave, they found 2 women, aged somewhere between 25 and 35, buried together. They are known as the Ladies of Téviec, and their grave is at once one of the most elaborate and one of the most disturbing of the European Mesolithic. The 2 women had been laid in a pit dug into a mound of discarded shells, and over them the mourners built a canopy, a protective roof made of red deer antlers. Their bodies were adorned with ornaments made from pierced seashells, Necarius and periwinkle, worn as necklaces, bracelets, and anklets, and the grave was dusted with red ochre. This was clearly a burial of great care. But when the bones were examined, it became clear that both women had died violently. One of them had suffered at least 5 separate wounds to the head, 2 of which may have been fatal, along with what appears to be a projectile injury striking between the eyes. That combination, extreme violence and elaborate, tender burial, is what makes Téviec so haunting. Across the whole cemetery, the Picards recovered 23 individuals in 10 graves, often with several people to a grave. The grave of the 2 women was eventually lifted from the ground as a single block and is now conserved and displayed at the Museum de Toulouse, where it was famously restored in recent years. Analysis of the bone chemistry confirmed a heavily marine diet, shellfish, fish, and sea mammals, exactly what you would expect of people living on a shell midden by the sea. So who killed these women? And why were they then buried so lavishly? The mainstream reading is interpersonal violence, perhaps a raid, during a period of pressure and resource stress as the first farmers began to approach the region. What the antler roof and the shell ornaments tell us is that violence and reverence were not opposites in this world. A person could be killed and still be mourned, still be honored with one of the most complex graves of the age. A more speculative view raises the possibility of ritual killing or sacrifice, though ordinary conflict fits the evidence better. The antler superstructure is one of the earliest built grave markers known in Western Europe, and the nearby island of Howidik produced similar graves, showing this was a shared regional tradition. From a grave shadowed by violence, we turn now to one shadowed by a vanished world, a cemetery in the middle of the largest desert on Earth. Number 4, the Gobero Cemetery of the Green Sahara. In the Tenere Desert of Niger, in the very heart of the Sahara, there is a place where the sand has eroded away to reveal bones. Human bones, hundreds of them, alongside the fossils of fish, crocodiles, and hippos. This is Gobero, discovered in the year 2000 by a team led by the paleontologist Paul Sereno of the University of Chicago. It is the largest and oldest known cemetery in the Sahara, and it exists because the desert was not always a desert. During what scientists call the African humid period, the Sahara was green, dotted with lakes and grassland. Gobero sat on the shore of one such lake, and 2 different populations buried their dead here across thousands of years. The first, the Qafzeh, lived roughly 10,000 to 8,000 years ago. They were tall and powerfully built, some of them standing around 1.9 meters, over 6 feet. The second, the Tenerian, came later, roughly 7,200 to 4,500 years ago, and they were more lightly built, living as herders and fishers along the lake edge. More than 200 burials have been documented across the dunes. The most famous of them is known simply as the Triple Burial. Radiocarbon dated to about 5,300 years ago, it holds a woman and 2 children laid on their sides, facing one another, their hands interlocked. The two children were roughly 5 and 8 years old. And when the researchers examined the sediment directly beneath the bodies, they found pollen. The dead had been laid down on a bed of flowers. Why all three died at the same moment is unknown. Disease and poisoning have both been proposed, but the cause remains a mystery. The findings were published in the journal PLOS One in 2008, with the bioarchaeology led by Christopher Stoyanovsky of Arizona State University. The graves at Gobero are rich with detail. One Tenarian man was buried with his head resting on a clay pot. Another rested his head on the shell of a turtle, like a pillow. There are harpoon points, fish hooks, and ornaments, the tools of a people who lived by a lake that has since utterly vanished beneath the sand. The mainstream interpretation ties the whole site to climate. As the Sahara greened and dried and greened again, human occupation followed the water until the final drying, around 4,500 to 3,500 years ago, sealed the cemetery under advancing dunes. The shift from the robust Kiphian to the lighter Tenarian may reflect a change of population or simply a change of diet and lifestyle. Gobero is proof that the greatest hot desert on Earth was, within human memory, a green land where people buried their children on flowers. And our next grave carries that same theme of tenderness back into the depths of the Ice Age. Number 5, the Romito Dwarf Burial. In the region of Calabria, in southern Italy, there is a rock shelter called Riparo del Romito near the town of Papasadero. Excavated by Paolo Graziosi beginning in the early 1960s, it dates to the late Upper Paleolithic, roughly 10,000 to 11,000 years ago, and it contains a burial that has become one of the most important pieces of evidence for compassion in the deep past. The burial is known as Romito II. It holds a young man who had a rare form of dwarfism, a condition called a chromosomic dysplasia. He stood only about 1 to 1.3 meters tall, with severely shortened forearms. In a hunter-gatherer world that demanded constant physical work, running, throwing, carrying, climbing, a body like his would have been at a profound disadvantage. He could not have performed many of the tasks his community depended on, and yet he survived to around 17 years of age. That survival in that world does not happen by accident. It means the group actively supported him, fed him, protected him, and carried him when they moved. He was not buried alone. He lies in a shared grave with an adult woman, known as Romito I, the smaller figure held against her. And on the wall of the shelter above the burials, someone carved an image of a great bovid, an aurochs, or a wild bull, about 1.2 meters long. It is one of the finest examples of Paleolithic rock engraving in all of Italy. The pairing of a monumental artwork and a human grave in the same shelter suggests this was a place of real ritual significance. The dwarfism diagnosis and its implications were established by anthropologists, including David Freyer of the University of Kansas. This burial sits at the heart of a whole field of study, what the researcher Lorna Tilley called the bioarchaeology of care, the practice of reading acts of caregiving from the evidence left in ancient bones. The mainstream interpretation of Romito II is straightforward and powerful. Here is direct evidence that Paleolithic people cared for the disabled, that they did not abandon those who could not contribute in the obvious ways. A more speculative reading wonders whether his unusual body gave him a special status, perhaps as a shaman or ritual figure, though there is no way to prove it. Red ochre was present in the burial, consistent with the widespread mortuary customs of the age, and several other people were buried at Romito, making it a small cemetery rather than a single grave. This young man was cared for and laid to rest roughly 5,000 years before anyone anywhere worked metal. And the theme of care reaches beyond our own species, as our next grave shows, where a human hand rests forever on an animal. Number 6. The Ain Mallaha Woman and Puppy Burial. In the Hula Valley of northern Israel lies a site called Ain Mallaha, also known as Einan. It was excavated by Jean Perrot beginning in the 1950s and later by François Vallat and Hamoudi Khalili. It belonged to the Natufian culture, the semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers who lived across the Levant roughly 15,000 to 11,500 years ago, and who were, in a real sense, the ancestors of the world's first farmers. And in one grave here, dated to about 12,000 years ago, there is a small and quiet gesture that reaches across all that time. The grave holds an elderly person, often described as a woman, and the body has been arranged so that one hand rests deliberately over the body of a young canid, a puppy, or a wolf pup. Whether that animal was already a domesticated dog or a tamed wolf is still debated by specialists. What is not debated is the placement. Someone laid that hand upon that animal on purpose. It is among the very earliest pieces of evidence we have for an emotional or ritual bond between humans and dogs, captured at the exact threshold where the wolves were becoming our companions. The Natufians at Ain Mallaha lived in semi-subterranean, round houses with stone foundations, some of the earliest architecture associated with settled life. Their burials often included ornaments made from dentalium shell and carved bone pendants, and the site was used for burial over many phases, holding dozens of individuals. Some later burials in the region show the removal of skulls, a practice that would intensify in the Neolithic that followed. This was a people harvesting wild cereals intensively, standing right at the edge of agriculture. The mainstream interpretation of the puppy burial places it at the dawn of the human-dog relationship, as wolves were drawn into human camps by scraps and warmth and slowly reshaped into dogs. Placing the animal in a human grave signals that it was valued, whether as a companion or as something with ritual meaning. A more speculative reading imagines the pup as a spirit guide, accompanying the dead person onward, an idea that is impossible to test but easy to feel. The fact that the buried human was elderly is itself meaningful. It tells us this community cared for its old as well as its young. In the scientific literature, the Ain Mallaha dog is almost always paired with one other grave, far away in Europe, as the two oldest signs of the bond between people and dogs. We will come to that second grave shortly, but first, another burial of overwhelming tenderness, this time between a mother and her newborn child. Number 7. The Vedbæk mother and infant on a swan's wing. In 1975, during construction work at Vedbæk just north of Copenhagen in Denmark, workers uncovered a Mesolithic cemetery at a place called Bonn-Oberkassel. It belonged to the unearthed culture, the coastal foragers of southern Scandinavia, and it dates to around 7,000 years ago. Among its graves is one that has become an enduring emblem of the antiquity of human grief. The grave, numbered 8, holds a young woman aged only around 18 to 20. Beside her lies a newborn infant, almost certainly her child. And the baby has been laid to rest not on the bare earth, but on the outstretched wing of a swan. The pair may have died together in childbirth, one of the most common causes of death for young women throughout human history. Beside the infant, the mourners placed a flint blade at its hip, a type of grave good more often associated with adult men, as though the child had been granted a status it never lived to earn. Red ochre was scattered over the woman's head and pelvis. The swan's wing is what makes this grave unforgettable. Organic material like feathers almost never survives 7,000 years, and its preservation here lets us witness a single, deliberate act of tenderness from the deep past. The Bonn-Oberkassel cemetery held at least 17 individuals across 22 graves, spanning the whole community, men, women, and children. And the grave goods varied in a patterned way. Men were often buried with flint tools, while women and children were given ornaments made from the teeth of red deer and wild boar. One grave held an elderly man with a bone dagger, another held 3 people together. That patterning tells us something important. Even among mobile coastal foragers, this was a structured society with recognized social roles expressed in death through the objects placed in the ground. The mainstream interpretation of the swan's wing sees it as symbolic, perhaps a soul bird carrying the infant onward, perhaps simply a gesture of overwhelming tenderness by grieving parents. A more speculative reading connects the swan to bird symbolism found in much later cultures, though we cannot trace such a thread across so many thousands of years. Isotope studies of the unearthed show a heavily marine diet, seals, fish, and shellfish. And these were affluent foragers who resisted farming for centuries after it had reached Central Europe. Together with the cemetery at Skadholm in Sweden, Bonn-Oberkassel reveals just how complex the mortuary customs of these hunter-gatherers really were. And now we rewind further than any grave we have seen so far to the very origin of burial itself. Number 8. The Skhul and Qafzeh burials. On the slopes of Mount Carmel and in a cave near Nazareth in northern Israel are 2 sites that push the story of human burial back almost unimaginably far. They are called Skhul and Qafzeh. Excavation of Skhul began in the 1930s under Theodore McCown and Arthur Keith, and work at Qafzeh continued later under Bernard van der Meersch. And the burials they contain are among the oldest deliberate human interments anywhere on Earth, dated by thermoluminescence and electron spin resonance to somewhere between 90,000 and 120,000 years ago. The people buried here were early Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, which means our species was burying its dead with apparent ceremony long before it left Africa in the migrations that would populate the world. And the details are astonishing for their age. At Skhul, an adult male known as Skhul 5 was buried holding the massive lower jaw of a wild boar against his chest, an apparent offering. At Qafzeh, a juvenile of about 13 years, Qafzeh 11, was buried with the antlers of a large red deer placed over the upper body, the hands positioned around them. Nearby, a young adult and a child lay close together, possibly a double burial expressing some relationship in life. At Qafzeh, archaeologists also found pierced Nacerius shells, stained with ochre, among the earliest known personal ornaments in the human record. These shells had been carried inland from the Mediterranean coast, and lumps of red ochre and ochre-stained tools point to the symbolic use of pigment around the dead, roughly 100,000 years ago. These were people who coexisted in the region with Neanderthals, who were also burying their dead at nearby sites like Kabara and Tebun. The mainstream interpretation is that Skhul and Qafzeh give us the earliest secure evidence of intentional burial with grave goods by our own species. The boar jaw and the deer antlers were deliberate offerings, implying a belief in something beyond death, or at the very least, a powerful drive to mark the identity of the dead. But there is a genuine scientific dispute here. Skeptics point out that a cave floor is full of animal bones and ask how we can be certain that a boar jaw or a set of antlers was placed on purpose rather than lying there by chance. Cut marks on some of the remains have even fueled debate over whether mortuary treatment included defleshing. What is clear is that the shell beads studied by researchers including Francesco De Rico and Huyn Zilion show the long-distance transport of symbolic objects. These sites anchor the argument that art, ornament, and burial arose in Africa and the Levant tens of thousands of years before the so-called creative revolution in Europe. And now, having reached the origin of human burial, we return to that second famous grave of a dog. Number 9, the Bonn-Oberkassel Dog Burial. In 1914, quarry workers cutting basalt from a hillside above the Rhine at Bonn-Oberkassel in Germany uncovered a grave. It dated to the very end of the last ice age, around 14,000 years ago, in the period archaeologists call the Magdalenian. Inside were two humans, an older man of around 40 to 50, and a younger woman of around 20 to 25, and with them were the remains of a dog. That dog is the reason this grave matters so much. For a long time, the significance of the animal was underappreciated, but a detailed reanalysis published in 2018, led by Luke Janssens, transformed our understanding. It confirmed that this is the oldest securely dated domestic dog found buried in association with humans, and the study of the dog's teeth revealed something remarkable. This was a juvenile animal that had survived a severe bout of canine distemper, a viral disease that is usually fatal, and especially so without care. The dental evidence suggested the illness struck when the pup was around 3 to 4 months old, and that it recurred. Think about what that means. For a young dog to survive multiple episodes of distemper, it would have needed intensive nursing, being kept warm, being given water and food, being cleaned and comforted through weeks of illness. And during all that time, a sick puppy is of no practical use to a hunting community whatsoever. It cannot herd or guard or hunt. The only reason to keep it alive is that the people wanted to. This is some of the clearest evidence we have that Ice Age humans formed genuine emotional bonds with animals. A second, older canid tooth in the grave suggests the remains of a second dog may also have been present. The grave held more than the dog. There was a carved bone pin and a piece of art, the figure of an elk or moose worked onto a length of antler, tying the burial to the rich artistic traditions of the Magdalenian. Red ochre coated the human bones. The mainstream interpretation could hardly be simpler or more moving. The dog was a companion, and it was buried with its people. A more speculative reading imagines the dog as a guide or guardian escorting the dead into an afterlife. an idea that fits many later cultures but cannot be tested here. Genetic studies place the domestication of dogs somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 years ago, and Oberkassel is the firmest archaeological anchor we have for an early date. Together with the puppy at Mallaha, it brackets the emergence of the human-dog bond across 2 continents. This sick pup was nursed and buried with its family roughly 9,000 years before the invention of writing. And for our final grave, we come to the most purely human image of them all, number 10, the Lovers of Valdaro. In 2007, during construction near Valdaro, on the outskirts of the city of Mantua in northern Italy, archaeologists uncovered a Neolithic grave that would travel around the world. It dates to roughly 6,000 years ago, and the excavation was directed by Elena Maria Menotti. What her team found was a young man and a young woman, both estimated to have died around the age of 20, lying face to face, their arms and legs intertwined in an embrace. They are known inevitably as the Lovers of Valdaro. The pose is what stops people in their tracks. In the Neolithic, the standard burial was a single body, laid on its side with the knees drawn up. A double grave arranged so that 2 people face each other, limbs entwined as though sleeping together, is extraordinarily rare. And the mystery deepens when you look at the bones themselves, because they show no obvious signs of a violent death. These were 2 healthy young people who died at the same time, for reasons we cannot recover. Small grave goods accompanied them, flint tools including a knife blade and arrowheads, marking this as a normal, respectful burial for their community, early farmers of the Po Plain. To preserve the embrace, the pair were lifted from the ground as a single block of earth and are now displayed together at the Archaeological Museum of Mantua. The mainstream interpretation is careful. The 2 were buried at the same time and arranged in this pose by the people who mourned them, an expression of a bond that the living wished to record. Whether that bond was romantic love, or kinship, or something else entirely, the bones cannot say. It is even possible that the embrace was a mortuary convention rather than a literal portrait of affection, but the emotional pull is almost impossible to resist, and popular legend has crowned them a prehistoric Romeo and Juliet, a story unsupported by evidence yet powerful all the same. What we can say for certain is that arranging 2 bodies in such an intimate embrace required placing them together while they were still soft very shortly after death. Someone chose to lay these 2 young people down facing each other, and to fold their arms around one another, and to bury them that way for eternity. The cause of their joint death remains an enduring puzzle, and the Lovers of Valdaro, laid to rest roughly 1,500 years before the great stones of Stonehenge were raised, have become one of the most recognizable images of emotion in all of prehistory. 10 graves, 10 shocks, and now it is worth asking what, beneath all the strangeness, they actually have in common. Step back from the individual graves and a pattern begins to emerge. At every single one of these sites, the dead were not simply disposed of. They were placed deliberately, with thought and effort, and often at real cost. That act of deliberate placement is itself one of the oldest signals we have of the human mind at work. A body left where it fell is nature. A body arranged, adorned, and marked is culture. Look at how often water appears. The heads at Kanaljorden were sunk into a lake. The mummies of Cladh Hallan were passed through a bog. Across northern Europe, wetlands were treated as thresholds, places to give something precious or dangerous to the earth. Look at how often the dead were kept and curated rather than immediately buried, the composite ancestors of Cladh Hallan held above ground for centuries, against the immediate embrace of the Lovers of Valdaro. Look at the grave goods, running like a thread from a 100,000-year-old boar. Jaw at Skhul, to Neolithic flint knives in Italy. And look at the ochre, that red mineral pigment appearing again and again. At Skhul, at Romito, at Vedbæk, at Oberkassel, across a span of 100,000 years and thousands of kilometers. Animals appear in human graves, dogs at Mallaha, in Oberkassel, deer antlers used as canopies and offerings. Relationships are made visible, lovers, a mother and her newborn, a cared-for young man held against an adult. Violence and reverence sit side by side at Téviec and at Kanaljorden, refusing to resolve into a simple story of either brutality or tenderness. Social roles show up in the differing goods given to men, women, and children at Vedbæk and Gobero. And burial becomes a way of claiming a place, of anchoring a lineage to a house, and its land at Cladh, Hallan. Every unsettling detail we have looked at, once you sit with it, resolves into a recognizable human motive: grief, belief, love, the desire to remember and to belong. The details shock us. The impulses behind them are entirely our own. One thread deserves to be pulled on its own because it may be the most surprising thing these graves reveal. It is the evidence of care. In recent decades, archaeologists have developed a formal way of studying this, sometimes called the bioarchaeology of care, pioneered by the researcher Lorna Tilley. The idea is that a skeleton can preserve not just how a person died, but how they were looked after while they lived. Consider the evidence we have already met. The young man at Romito with a severe form of dwarfism, who nonetheless survived to around 17 in a demanding hunter-gatherer world. That survival is not a fact about him. It is a fact about the people around him, who must have fed and protected and carried him for years. Consider the dog at Oberkassel, a puppy that survived repeated bouts of a usually fatal disease, which could only have happened if human hands nursed it through months of sickness when it could give nothing back. Consider the elderly woman at Mallaha, cared for into old age, her hand resting on a young animal she may have loved. The method has its challenges. It is not always easy to distinguish genuine active care from simple survival, and honest researchers acknowledge the uncertainty. How much can we really read from bones? But the strength of these particular cases lies in their cost. Caring for someone who cannot reciprocate, an infant, an elderly person, a disabled young man, a sick animal, brings no survival advantage. It is expensive in time and food and effort, and it happens anyway. That is precisely why it is such a powerful signal of social bonds. What these graves quietly demolish is the old caricature of prehistory as a brutal contest, where the weak were simply left behind. The deep past was full of people who nursed the sick, sheltered the vulnerable, and grieved their dead. In that, at least, they were exactly like us. There's another thread worth following, and it is made of objects. The things placed with the dead are among our best windows into the emergence of the symbolic mind. Chief among them is red ochre. It is the oldest and most persistent of all mortuary materials, appearing at Skhul 100,000 years ago and still being used at Oberkassel and Vedbæk tens of thousands of years later. We do not know exactly what it meant, but its associations are suggestive: the color of blood, of life, perhaps of protection or transformation. Whatever it signified, people reached for it again and again when they buried their dead. Then there are the ornaments. The pierced Nacerius shells at Qafzeh are among the earliest personal ornaments known anywhere, and crucially, they had been carried inland from the coast. That transport implies networks, exchange, and the assignment of value to an object for reasons that are purely symbolic. A shell bead does nothing practical. It means something. The recurring offerings tell a similar story: the boar jaw at Skhul, the deer antlers at Qafzeh, and Téviec and Romito, the tools placed in the graves at Vedbæk and Valdaro, tying the dead to their skills and their world. At Gobero, the offering was even more fragile: a bed of flowers, a perishable symbol that almost never survives. This raises a genuine and unresolved debate. When we find a jaw or a set of antlers in a grave, how do we know it was placed there on purpose and not simply lying on the cave floor? Researchers such as Francesco De Rico and Juan Zillon have spent careers working through exactly these questions, and the shell beads are among the strongest evidence because they had to be gathered, pierced, and carried. What all of this points to is that symbolic behavior, the making and using of things that stand for ideas, arose in Africa and the Levant far earlier than the old story of a European creative revolution allowed. To bury someone with a meaningful object is to believe on some level that meaning outlasts the body. And that belief may be as old as our species. Yet for all we have pieced together, an enormous amount remains genuinely unknown. It would be dishonest to end without admitting how much these graves still refuse to tell us. Every one of them guards a question we cannot answer. Why do the skulls at Kanaljorden show that strange sex-patterned violence, and who mounted the heads on stakes? Was the composite mummification at Cladh Hallan a widespread custom or a rare and special act? What lay behind the wounds on the two women at Téviec? A raid, a feud, or something stranger? What killed the woman and 2 children at Gobero all at the same moment and left them to be buried on flowers? The questions multiply. Was the young man at Romito simply a cared-for dependent, or did his unusual body give him a special role? Was the animal at Mallaha a true domestic dog or a tamed wolf? What did a swan's wing mean to the people at Vedbæk? Were the burials at Skhul and Qafzeh truly intentional, and were the grave goods really placed by design? How were the dogs at Oberkassel cared for in daily life? And what, in the end, killed 2 healthy young people at Valdaro and left them in each other's arms? Beneath all these specific puzzles lies a deeper one. The problem of inferring belief from material remains. Dating carries uncertainty. Preservation is wildly uneven, favoring bogs and anaerobic mud and shell sand, while erasing almost everything else, so that what we see is a scattered and biased sample of what once existed. And there is always the temptation to project our own emotions onto ancient graves, to see love and grief where the reality may have been stranger and less familiar. Mortuary archaeology is full of competing schools of interpretation, and reasonable experts disagree. But new methods, ancient DNA, isotope analysis, the study of surviving proteins, keep reopening old cases and overturning old certainties. These graves are not closed books. They are ongoing conversations, and every generation of researchers finds new things to say. Return, one last time, to that image we began with, human skulls mounted on wooden stakes in a Swedish lake. It is genuinely unsettling. But everything we have learned since should change how we see it. That was not an act of horror. It was in all likelihood an act of reverence, a community tending to its ancestors in the way that made sense to them. And that is the paradox that runs through all 10 of these sites. The details that unsettle us most, the rearranged bodies, the mounted heads, the graves shadowed by violence, are almost always expressions of love, grief, and belief. Burial is one of the oldest and most human of all our behaviors. Long before writing, before farming, before cities, our ancestors were laying their dead in the ground with ochre and ornaments and offerings, with dogs and swans and flowers, with the bodies of those they had loved folded into an embrace. From a boar jaw pressed to a chest 100,000 years ago to 2 young people buried face to face 6,000 years ago, the thread of human grief is unbroken. The dead encode the values of the living. They tell us what these people thought mattered, and again, what mattered was care, and relationship, and memory. We should be humble about how much we can read from a grave, and honest about how much is lost forever. Preservation gave us these 10 glimpses by accident, and took countless others away. But the glimpses we have are enough to see something clearly. These were not primitive strangers. They were people who cared for the sick, who buried their children on flowers, who could not bear to let the dead simply vanish. To translate deep time into human scale, you need only stand at the edge of one of these graves. Across 8,000 years, or 100,000, the message is the same. Someone here was loved, and someone here refused to forget them. To bury the dead with meaning is to be human. And that, more than any single unsettling detail, is what the ground keeps trying to tell us.